Hi, my name is Schneibel. I'm going to be presenting Wonder Woman, an analysis of the origin of the Amazons of Dahomey. I would like to take this moment to thank my mentor, Professor Bethanie for all of her guidance, and OMNI for having me today. So I just want to start with introducing who the Amazons of Dahomey are. So they were established in around the 17th century. They were an all-female military regiment of the Kingdom of Dahomey, and so again, all-female, and that was very uncommon at this time, like across the globe, basically, especially in Western nations. Women in military was very not common, like at all. But they didn't just automatically become these women in the military. They started as hunters, then they moved up to royal executioners, a King's Guard, and a combat group, and they eventually came to an end with French colonialism in 1894 when the French took over the Kingdom of Dahomey and made it a protectorate. After the Scramble for Africa. So after I learned about who these women were, I was wondering basically how did they come to be? So how did women end up as in combat roles in the military, and what were the circumstances that allotted for that to happen? And also, why didn't that happen in Western societies? Why do you see it so much later? So those are my research questions. How did the Amazon women become a combat group, and why did it take Western nations well into the 20th and 21st century to allow women into combat roles in the military? That led me to my thesis that the Amazons of Dahomey were able to become a combat force due to the Atlantic slave trade reducing the population of men, the need for larger armies to fight against colonization, and pre-existing gender norms that permitted women to be in positions of power. So the Kingdom of Dahomey is located on the west coast of Africa. It was established in the 15th century, and today it is known as Benin. And it's very significant that it's on the west coast right here because at the start of the 1500s, we saw a lot of interaction with Europeans at this point in time. And Europeans wanted to come here for trade, for slaves, metals, ivory, gold, oil, etc. And a lot of the scholarship and sources that we have about Dahomey and about the Amazons of Dahomey come from these Europeans because much of African history is oral and has been lost throughout the years, unfortunately. But the problem with having only Western sources available is that they have their own unique bias. And so a lot of the stuff you hear from these Western scholars doesn't really add up to what we know from the African side. So for instance, some Western scholars say that they got their start after a giant elephant hunt, and they were hunting, killing these elephants, and then suddenly they were like, the king was like, you know what, you should be warriors. Other ones say that while other Western scholars say that these women had to be celibate their entire lives and that they renounced their womanhood and declared themselves as men. But again, that's not corroborated with anything else, so that kind of makes this a little bit difficult to look at. And one of the biggest biases that comes with the Amazons of Dahomey is the name the Amazons of Dahomey. So that was given to them by the Europeans. They were known as their own people as the Mino, meaning our mother. But again, as the Europeans called them, the Amazons or the Amazons of Black Sparta. The name Amazons comes from Greek mythology. And it is the Amazon women of Greek mythology were the manifestation of men's fear of women. So the Amazons were a society of women that lived on an island, and they waged a systematic war against all men. They wanted to wipe men off the planet, basically. And so Europeans, being as creative as they are, whenever they see a group of women who are fierce, who are warriors, they give them the name of Amazons. So a pop culture reference to this to kind of give you guys a little bit of context on that. So here we have the Amazons of the mascara from Wonder Woman, and then we have the Black Panther warriors from Africa. And so the Black Panther warriors were actually modeled after the Amazons of Dahomey, even in the outfits that they're wearing right here. And the Amazons of the mascara from Wonder Woman were modeled after the Amazons of Greek mythology. Now if you look at them, do these look similar other than the fact that they're women? No. And that's the major difference here. It would be like, if I was a European, I would look at this and I'd be like, wow, Amazons. And that's clearly instead of noticing the distinct differences. So again, that's our Western bias that we see here. So one of the reasons that the Amazons of Dahomey were able to become this combat group is because of the slave trade. So prior to the start of the Atlantic slave trade in around the 1500s, there was an Arab slave trade going on, and they did not take anywhere near the same amount of slaves as the Atlantic slave trade, but they also took men and women and not just men. So then when the Atlantic slave trade started, obviously they took a lot of men from Africa, close to millions, and so that led to a problem with the population. There were extremely higher amounts of women than men in the population. Unfortunately, because there is no census at this given point in time, I don't have any stats to give you, but based on multiple reports from observers, we do know that there was a higher percentage of women in the population than men. So because there was not a lot of men, women were able to fill these roles of men in society and then the roles that they would fill, which is why we got women in the military. In addition, we have the Scramble for Africa. So for those of you that don't know, the Scramble for Africa happened in around the 19th century, and that was when Europeans decided, after the Industrial Revolution, they needed to have more resources and they also needed to expand their population, so they looked to Africa to take over all of it. So this is 1880, and this is how many European nations took over from right here. The colors represent them, and this is 1913. Obviously, there's a stark difference between the two. By 1913, they managed to take over practically the entire continent of Africa. And so the people of Dahomey were fighting against this colonization for around 20 years, and the Amazons of Dahomey were very influential in this because the men that were fighting in the military, first off, they could not compete with the technology of the Europeans. They had guns, and the Amazons and the people of Dahomey were fighting with like spears. So there was really no contest. So the weaponry kind of reduced the population of men, but then there wasn't any men really available to fill up those roles because of the slave trade. So that opened up roles for the women to take up for these roles and for the Amazon regiment. At the peak, the Amazons represented 1/3 of the army of Dahomey, which is around 10,000 people. Another reason that the Amazons of Dahomey were able to become themselves is because of the role of women in West African societies in general in Africa. So the West Coast of Africa had seen many women in political roles throughout time. So they had been chiefs, queens, queen mothers, and influential members of the royal lineage. They also had defendable political rights in certain tribes, in certain areas, and they were traders and property owners. Women being property owners was not something seen in Western societies like the United States or the United Kingdom at this time whatsoever. And especially they did not have their own defendable political rights. So looking at these reasons, that's one of the reasons that society was so susceptible and was allowing women to be these members of the Amazons. So comparing the Western nations to the women of Dahomey. So Dahomey, we had women in combat roles in the 1700s. The United States of America and the United Kingdom did not allow women into every single branch of the armed forces in every single position until 2016. Again, 2016, 2 years ago, and Dahomey allowed that in the 1700s, which I don't know, but that was absolutely mind-boggling to me. I didn't know we were that behind the game, but we really were. So when I looked at that, I came to this idea of a civilized nation. So one of these things about African societies at this point in time is that all these white people from Europe, they thought that they were the pinnacle of society. They were the civilized people. They were the ones responsible for making everyone else civilized. And this idea by Cecil Rhodes, who was a European colonizer from England, he made a lot of money off the diamond trade in Africa, and exploiting all the resources and people, of course. His idea was that I contend we are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race, as in the Anglo-Saxon people. And so this type of idea was very widespread amongst Europeans. I'm not going to say all of them because I don't know all of them, but very widespread across multiple Europeans. And so when I look at this idea, I just kind of stop and I think about this, and I'm like, looking at it from today's standpoint, we kind of look at equality as a reason of, as not a reason, it's almost a factor in for a country to be a civilized country. For us to look at a country as truly developed, we look for this equality across the board. And we say that most countries have it. They don't, but we're almost there. And so we look at this equality, and so looking at this from a modern standpoint, would we say that a country like England, who has women as subordinates to their husbands, women do not have their own property rights, the husbands are in control of them, would we say that society is more civilized than a country that allows equality amongst their men and women, and also that lets women be in the armed forces? Thank you. Sorry if I talked really fast. Questions? Yes?
How did gender roles in Dahomey change after exposure to the West?
Oh, well. What happened there is after the French took over, the Amazon forces just completely went away, and their roles actually were diminished because the men came in, the French came in and they're like, we are the white saviors, this is wrong, this is not civilized, and then, so we saw actually diminished rights of women after the Europeans came in. Yes?
Great job.
Thank you.
Great job. But my question is, do you have, did you come across any source material about what it was like for these French soldiers who were male to be fighting against female soldiers.
Yes, I did.
What was that response?
They were, so when a lot of the things I saw is that they were often taken aback by that they were women. And almost they didn't view them as women in some ways. They, like, and again, like I was saying earlier, they, like the stories they came up to kind of look around it is they were like impressed by them, but then at the same time they were kind of confused by them because they didn't really understand why women were fighting, which is why they came up with the whole women have to be celibate and they renounced their womanhood as a way for them to be soldiers.
Do you know of any accounts of like rape or looting? Because that was oftentimes a reality of these colonial engagements. Did you come across any sort of source material that?
I did not come across anything that said that the Amazon women were subject to that. They were fierce in their own way, so I think those Europeans would have stayed away. But it might have happened, I just didn't come across that.
My last question was, you brought up the example of the U.S. and the United Kingdom.
Yes.
Interestingly enough, the French, who were the colonizers of many of these portions of West Africa, had they made any change in their position on women in combat roles?
As of now, I'm not 100% positive on this. I looked at the UK and the US because they're just kind of like Western. But I believe that the French do allow women in all their forces. I do not know how long it took. I would imagine it took the same amount of time as the US and the UK. I do not have a specific information.
I'd be really curious because, I mean, the French women got the right to vote well after, World War II.
Right.
And, like, French standards of, like, gender roles,
Gender roles are so much more.
strict.
Yeah.
Yeah, stringent. Oh, that was.
But at the same time, there's also the story of Joan of Arc. So.
Who, of course, yeah, except that then
Well
the
played,
English, of course, were at the stake for exactly what, and
But she
for
wasn't in combat
specifically-
role, though.
Yeah, but for specifically cross-dressing too, and
Yeah.
acting in the terms of a man, it wasn't for her leading troops, it was that she refused to wear womenly clothes.
She wore pants, so they killed her.
Yes, exactly, it comes down to pants.
Yes.
Did you come across any ritual that the woman had to go through to be one of these Amazon?
I did not come across that, but the Amazon women were selected from the king's third wives. So the king had around like 3,000 wives, something completely ridiculous like that. The initial Amazon women they were his third wife. So the wives he deemed were too ugly for him to sleep with or to have children with. Those are the ones he initially selected to be the king's women. It obviously grew beyond that. But ritualistic, again, as the Europeans say, that they renounce their womanhood, and that some of them even like cut off their breasts. Again, I'm not sure if that's true because that's a European account, and I'm taking everything they say with a grain of salt. So,
So they were his manlier wives.
yes, it's a different one, yeah.
You're too butch for me.
There's a spear, stand over there.
Any further questions? Yeah.
Do you know some of the positions that weren't allowed before 2016 for the U.S.? Like, what were like some of the rankings that like weren't allowed for?
So
women?
are we talking about the U.S.?
Yeah, the
Okay.
U.S.
So the U.S. they kind of like went across, and so women have been fighting. Like I should say this too. Women have been fighting in the military since the American Revolution in the U.S. They've just been like not showing it. So they've been nurses. They've been in the military. It's just that the fact it's all combat roles. And so before 2016, I want to say it was Navy SEALs were one of the last ones to allow women to join. But it's been progressive over time, and I know the Marines are pretty far behind as well. But I don't have those specific rankings.
It was just, in combat roles, it was just,
It was like
2 years ago,
It
yeah,
was-
they were
yeah.
one of the last ones too, and especially for the special forces units.
Mm.
But, I mean, like, if you look at military history, right, you have women in all different kinds of roles.
Yeah.
You know, in support positions, logistics, just not combat.
or women that dressed up as men
Is
to
that,
do that too.
what was your word that you used, Zach? Your masculine
Masculine
term?
feminine.
Yeah, that just prevented
Uh-huh.
women in those roles.
Thank you.
Great.